Hi, my name's Ben Lacey and I'm a partner at Aquila Super. And a question that pops up from now and again from our clients is there a legal requirement to have a commercial lease in place if there are unrelated tenants in a fund's property? Okay, well, it's an interesting question because the SIS Act itself does not have any specific legislation that requires a commercial lease to be in place. That's not actually the end of the story. There's other SIS Act legislations and trustee obligations that need to be considered that I'll have a chat with you about now. Okay, the biggest one is the idea of the arm's length test. Now, you may have heard of the arm's length test. It's contained in Section 109 of the SIS Act. It basically specifies that all investments of a superannuation entity must be made and maintained on an arm's length basis. Now, what does that mean? Basically, it means that all investments of a superannuation entity must be transacted on a commercial arm's length basis. Each party to the transaction must be a reasonable, unrelated party to the transaction. The test would be, what would a reasonable landlord do in a standard commercial leasing arrangement with an unrelated tenant? Now, many people consider that the arm's length test simply applies to whether or not you're dealing with a related party. And although that is the time that you might use it as a test, as a benchmark for those sort of transactions, the actual legislation is not specific to just related party transactions. So it actually covers everything that occurs within a fund. Now, beyond the idea of the arm's length test, you also need to consider what are known as the trustee covenants. Now, the trustee covenants are contained in Section 52B of the SIS Act, and it has some legislation that I'm going to speak to you. I'm going to sort of read off to you now. So prepare yourself because it is legal speak. The covenant specifies that the trustees must exercise in relation to all matters affecting the fund the same degree of care, skill and diligence as an ordinary prudent person would exercise in dealing with property of another for whom the person felt morally bound to provide. So what does that mean? In other words, the trustee should execute any transaction that occurs within the fund in the best interest of the members. So this is sometimes where there's confusion for SMSF trustees because they've come to an SMSF and they want the freedom to be able to do what they want, which is really one of the great benefits of having an SMSF. But they need to understand that their role as a trustee is distinct from their role as the beneficiary and the member. And so even if in the case of a leasing arrangement where you're basically dealing with this other party, whether or not you wouldn't have a lease in place outside of the fund is not the same because you don't have this trustee covenant in place. So even if a tenant is not related, a prudent trustee acting in the best interest of the fund members would be expected to have a written commercial lease in place for any leased asset to ensure that the fund's assets are protected. So why is this the case? So what does a commercial lease agreement provide that will assist with us meeting this arm's length test and the trustee covenants? Okay, if some trustees may say, well, I'm receiving monthly rent from my unrelated tenant, it's at a market rate, we're good to go. Well, a commercial lease provides more than just the agreed rent. A properly constructed commercial lease actually outlines the rights and obligations of both the landlord and the tenant. It also confirms that the lease itself is held in the name of the fund through the trustee. Provisions that are in commercial leases can include things like, the lease term, when to have rental reviews, what to do in the case of late or no payments, like are there penalties, eviction procedures, and so on. When dealing with a tenant, the trustee must be prepared to enforce its rights, including imposing these sorts of penalties in exactly the same way as they would in a commercial arm's length arrangement. Okay. Generally speaking, in a commercial rental scenario, it is widely accepted that a landlord would have a written commercial lease in place that specifies the terms and provides legal comfort and recourse in the case of a disagreement between the landlord and the tenant. So the last thing that you need to consider is, with a superannuation fund, there's a required annual audit to be conducted. Okay, so how does an auditor confirm that you're meeting these obligations if you don't have a written commercial lease in place? The arm's length test that I spoke about before is actually a reportable legislative requirement of the SIS Act. Okay, so if you don't meet the arm's length test, there's a risk that a contravention could be lodged and the ATO is informed. Okay, if the fund is found to have been disadvantaged due to a non-arm's length scenario, this can result in this contravention being lodged, but also has wider implications for the fund, because this can extend to whether or not the fund and the trustee has satisfied the sole purpose test, which is like a fundamental requirement for a complying SMSF to meet. So it's super important. In relation to the trustee covenants, it's not necessarily a reportable contravention, but it's like the vibe of what a trustee should be doing. So when an auditor is looking at transactions and arrangements that are in place, the idea of this trustee covenants and this, being a prudent trustee is something that your auditor is going to consider when they're evaluating what's occurred within a fund. So overall, although I mentioned at the beginning, drafting a commercial lease agreement with an unrelated tenant is not like a legislative requirement. It's certainly not advisable to have an undocumented lease in place. As mentioned, there are these legislative requirements and also this sort of guidance from the trustee covenants that you need to consider to meet your role and obligation as a trustee. If you're unsure if a lease agreement is required or needed in your fund, we highly recommend that you chat to your SMSF advisor, accountant, or auditor to ensure that you meet and satisfy your obligation.